Today's video is all about working with dipping pens and how to actually make marks directly onto the surface of the glass with a pen. If you've never actually used a dipping pen before, you're in for a treat. When I learned how to work with dipping pens and learned how to get the recipe for making the inks just right, it was an absolute game changer. It can be quite difficult sometimes to paint with brushes on glass, especially long rigger brushes. Controlling the movement of a brush is tricky. It's much more intuitive working with a dipping pen. It's very much like drawing with a pencil directly onto paper, or with a fountain pen and some ink drawing onto paper. I'm going to go through the process of how I mix traditional glass paints into a workable medium that works with a dipping pen. I'll show you the different proportions that I use. I'm also going to show you a couple of different makes of dipping pens that I feel confident in recommending to you. Surprisingly, not all dipping pens work very well with glass paints. I've tried a variety of different ones and I've landed on two that I feel confident in recommending to you, and I'll leave links in the comments below where you can actually source these dipping pens for yourself. So let's get into how to use a dipping pen, starting right now. What are dipping pens? Well, they look a little bit like this. This is two of the brands that I recommend. This one here I've been recommending for a while. You can basically get it on Amazon and it's relatively inexpensive. They're called comic pens and they come in a little box like this. So you can see here, comic pens based in Korea, chips of Korea. So they're really a simple device. They're basically a handle, a wooden handle like this with a kind of container here that holds the nibs. Now the nibs come in a variety of different sizes. You can see it comes a little box of nibs here. Some of them are small, a little bit too small to use. See this tiny little one here? It's a little bit too small. The bigger ones here tend to be the best ones. So they basically fit in, I don't know if the camera's picking that up, into a little container here, this little holding device. Slides in like this. You can pull them out easily to clean the nibs as well, clean them in a little bit of alcohol. So they come like this and we just dip them into ink. So this is the first brand here, and this is one I've recommended for the last couple of years to a lot of my students. And they're in the UK, it's about £12 for a box. This complete box is about £12, which is really inexpensive. And you know, if you look after them and don't apply too much pressure onto the nib, you'll be able to use these for many, many years. So really, these are my sort of go-to recommendations if you're starting out. But I was doing a class a little while ago, and one of my students was a tattoo artist, and she does a lot of interesting line work as well, and she recommended this dipping pen. Now, this is a Japanese dipping pen. It's called a Takikawa. I can't pronounce the rest of it here, and I do apologize to any Japanese audience members who are looking at this, shouting at the screen, going, "Christ almighty, Derek, you should know what it's called." Again, I'll leave links to an Amazon, my Amazon page where you can actually source this. So this is a slightly more expensive dipping pen. Let's have a little look at it and unbox it here. So it's a single pen holder like this, but it's a little bit more swanky and a little bit more upmarket because it has a rubberized handle here, which is very comfortable to hold. And you have also within the packet a selection of nibs. Now the nibs are really quite plentiful, as you can see here. Let's just open up the container. Oh, there's a little plastic thing holding this together. One second. The container also has a variety of nibs. Now these nibs, you can see the color of them is slightly different. They are silver. I don't know if it's stainless steel, but they feel more robust. They feel a little bit more substantial than these sort of brass bronze nibs here. And they are actually a little bit more hard wearing. And again, the mechanism for holding the nib is exactly the same as the previous nib. So let's just pick one here. They tend to be pretty much the same kind of size. There's not too much of a variation in size of the nibs. It looks as if actually they're all identical, if I'm fair. So lots of nibs to choose from, and they fit directly into the handle here like this. Easy to handle, easy to put in, easy to take out, and they're really comfortable. Obviously they work if you're left-handed or right-handed. So these two nibs are really useful. These are more expensive, and again I will leave links in this video to where you can access this one. And if you're going to go for a premium premium quality dipping pen, I would suggest this one, the Takikawa, or the Tachikawa, if it's pronounced that way. It is a more upmarket nib, and I think the nib is more robust and will last longer. So these are the two nibs that I recommend. You know, if you're just starting out and experimenting, get the cheap and cheerful Comic Pen ones. But if you're more serious about it, these are definitely worth the investment. They will last for years. Interestingly as well, the nibs actually fit in the existing smaller handle as well. So they work, they're kind of, they work in both handles. So, you know, just because you only get one handle with the more expensive nib, you can actually invest in a more nibs if you, you can invest in more handles if you need them as well. So they are interchangeable. So really useful pieces of kit. Now that I've introduced you to our dipping pens here, let's talk a little bit about making up the paint into a usable ink.
So what else will we need? We will need a mixing palette. I usually use a glass palette with some stoppers underneath. Our trusted palette knife, of course. The paint that we're using today is Reusch paint, which is fantastic. Tracing Black, an American paint, really nice to work with. The main medium for mixing is clove oil, but also we'll be adding a little bit of lavender oil. This is personal preference, but I like to add a little bit of lavender oil to it. A kiln jar or an equivalent jar that's airtight is really useful as well, together with your dipping pen of choice. So don't forget a couple of pipettes as well for mixing the oils together. You don't want the same pipette for different oils. So you'd mix your paint in the same way that you'd mix with water, grinding it very carefully, of course. Even although the Reusch paints are particularly well made, you still have to grind them for a good 5 minutes before you can put them into the jar. To this we'll then add our oil. I'm adding approximately twice as much clove oil as I am lavender oil, using different pipettes, of course, so that they don't contaminate both the containers of oil. Once we've got a reasonable amount of oil in, we mix until everything is well mixed in, and then you leave it for 24 hours. Don't use the pigment until it's sat for 24 hours. Okay, now we're ready to experiment with the consistency of it. After giving it a good mix again, we're just going to test the pigment. So generally speaking, you should be able to get 4 or 5 lengths out of a dip into the pigment. As you can see here, it's working particularly well. We need to make sure that the pigment is strong and that it's consistent. Too much oil and it'll become a little bit too watery, and too little oil it'll become too thick. So also just fill in some of the areas with larger areas of pigment and let that sit for a few minutes, because if there's too much oil, what you tend to find is the pigment draws into the center and doesn't have a nice dense finish. But that appears to be all working well, so we're ready to start actually drawing with it. And as a little extra tip, find a saucer such as this that you can angle your jar at by creating a little well of vitreous paint. It's a lot easier to introduce the nib and to load the nib when the jar is at an angle. So have fun playing with the pen. It really works in the same way that you would imagine drawing on paper. You vary the pressure of the nib to create thin lines and thick lines. Just be careful not to overload the nib, because you'll get a blob of paint on the surface of the glass if you do. Don't worry, it is not the end of the world if you create issues like that, like little blobs of paint in extra areas that are overfilled with pigment. What I tend to do is I put my kiln on and I have it at a low setting, sort of 50 degrees, and I put my painted pieces in to dry, and within about 40 minutes or so all of the vitreous paints have dried, and then they can be scratched back in the way that you'd scratch back paint normally with painting with brushes. It's a really kind of easy method to use. Just allow the paint to dry completely and then you can scratch it back. After you've fired the first layer, the tracing layers with the nib, you can then add additional layers by putting washes of pigment over the surface and texturizing it in the way that you would normally with regular brushwork. You can create lots of interesting effects, and the graphic quality of the nib helps to create quite a unique and exciting graphic design style, which is really unique to the nib. You can also add stains, obviously, to that. Here I'm adding silver stains mixed with glycol. Glycol is very good for blending. You can use a little badger brush like this to blend the stain to create different effects. You can scratch it out. You can also use a nib with silver stain, believe it or not, as well. This is a glycol mixture with silver stain. It's something that I don't use tremendously often because I don't think the results are great, but it does work if you want to play around with it. And here are the finished pieces, drawn with a nib, shaded with texturizing, and then stained on top. One of the great things about sharing these techniques with the wider audience is seeing what fellow creatives do with this new technique. I certainly find that students love working with it, and you can use original photographs like pets or children or images that you find. You can use those as sort of fundamental backgrounds in which to trace over and create your own independent artwork. So these are some examples of students that were working in the studio over the last year, developing their techniques. It's really nice to see how it develops. So I hope you enjoyed today's video and you feel suitably inspired to create your own work using a dipping pen. It's very intuitive, it's very easy to work with. Start with the basic outlines like this, and then you can develop it further. Here's some lovely examples of recent works from students.
I'd love to hear from you about how you're getting on with working with a dipping pen. Leave comments below this video and let me know. I'd just love to share this information with the creative community, putting it out there to fellow creatives to see what exciting artworks they create with it. Do check out my channel for lots more free tutorials like this one. And if you have enjoyed today's video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us get this information out to as many new creatives as possible. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.